This next project that we're going to be working on is called Weaving Emotions because we're going to be taking portraits of either yourself or other people that you want to work with, expressing different emotions and weaving those together. So this project does involve multiple steps, just like the layers project. And the purpose of that is to show you different ways that you can take projects a step further and just continue to experiment with combining multiple ideas and multiple directions into one composition. So we're going to be creating two portraits, and somehow you will decide how to put those back together. And I have a bunch of examples and a bunch of techniques that we're going to look at. But the learning targets and different things that I want you to get out of this project and be able to apply to all of your future projects is, first of all, taking and creating reference photos with good lighting. That's a definitely important skill to use for all your projects. I'm going to expect that you have at least one reference photo that you're using for your projects, unless we discuss something else to work for them. So make sure that you do understand how to take and create good reference pictures. We're going to be editing these reference photos in Photoshop. So I'm going to walk you through the basics of editing the value, contrast, and lighting. We're going to transfer these photos to a drawing with accurate proportions. There's going to be 3 different techniques that we're going to work on with those proportions. So you'll have an option between 2, and then the first one's going to be required. You're going to be creating value change and contrast. So we're going to look at ways to use charcoal, black and white charcoal on different colors of paper to create this. And then facial proportions. The purpose of really spending a good amount of time working on facial proportions and shading is because I feel like if you're able to master a portrait, you can master pretty much anything. Portraits are very difficult, and you have to get proportions lined up just right for them to look good and for them to work. So it's a great way to really refine your skills as an artist. Even if you're not going to do portraits for any other project, it's really important to understand the basics of proportion, and this is a great way to really get that practice. The practice that we're going to be doing throughout this project is all listed on the class website, so all the steps are there. There's a bunch of videos, so you can work at your own pace. But what you're going to be doing is, again, having those 2 reference photos. We're going to do value change practice. We're going to practice hatching, cross-hatching, and blending on white, black, and gray paper. So those are 3 main blending and shading techniques. There's obviously a lot more that you could use, but I want to see you practice and master those 3 specifically. We're going to do a facial feature study where you're practicing proportions and shading the mouth, nose, and lips on the white, black, and gray paper. This is important as well so that you're able to really pay attention to details, look at different techniques for shading, highlights, and shadows, and actually apply hatching, cross-hatching, and shading as well. Like I said previously, you're going to create 2 full portraits within this project. One will be implementing a freehand technique, which is where I will show you how to line things up with accurate proportions, just using freehand. Beyond that, we're going to be working with either the grid technique or a tracing technique. So I'll have videos for each of those, and you can choose which ones you want to work with. The last step is going to be putting everything together. So there's going to be 6 different techniques that you're able to choose from. You could always do more or add more to it beyond these, but just some ideas to get you started. And then from those 6 techniques, you're going to choose at least 2 to apply to your project. So I'm going to show you what those techniques are here in a second. So putting your 2 final portraits together, the 6 techniques are cutting up portraits into shapes, collaging materials on top of your portrait, yarn, watercolor, text, and Photoshop. So here's the example that I did in a lot of the videos. So here's the 2 portraits on the left using different techniques. For your portraits, you'll use different pictures. I just use the same picture for both to keep it simple for the videos. But for you guys, you'll really work on taking 2 pictures with different emotions, different angles. And then in the example that I have here, I put together a couple of them in Photoshop, overlaid them, changed the opacity, blended them, and then used watercolors. That's an example of a finished put together project with 2 techniques, but again, you can take it further and do even more with it. The first technique to consider, again, there's 6 and you'll choose 2, but the first one is cutting up portraits. This is one where you'd physically take your 2 pages and cut them up and piece them back together like a puzzle. So think about how you can do that. There's a lot of different ways you could go about it. These examples I have are not one specific to this project, so a lot of them don't have the 2 different portraits. They're not using charcoal, but I just wanted to show you different ways that you could take your 2 projects and cut them up and put them back together. This one on the right's interesting because it actually is using yarn, which includes a second technique, so that could be an interesting way to incorporate 2 together. This one's really cool because they're, again, putting it back together like a puzzle, but kind of spacing it out, and that creates a little more interest versus just randomly putting things back together. So they're thinking about the placement, moving things around. Another direction you could take it is maybe cutting out pieces like on the right here and having that negative space come through, and think about maybe what's going on in the background behind it. Maybe you use watercolor and paint the entire background and then cut out little bits and pieces and glue it on top of the watercolor background. And then this one on the left is more woven with the 2, so they're actually weaving those papers together where they cut out strips horizontally, cut out strips vertically, and then wove them together. So that's an interesting way to piece them back. This one on the left is very detailed, and this could be really cool to kind of think about multiple layers of putting those back together. Again, weaving things in and out, overlapping. The lines are going different directions to create movement. So think back to that last project. How can you incorporate movement, focal point, and so on? And then the one on the right is not only cutting out pieces from the portrait, but maybe you could cut out and collage pictures of construction paper, or you paint a separate piece of paper and you cut out those into triangles or different shapes to add as well. And then here's another one. It almost looks like shattered or broken glass. So think about how you would cut out those shapes. Are they going to be just triangles, or can you cut them out to look like broken glass or something else? All right, so the second technique is collaged materials. You could really use anything for this. This specific example has some newspaper, so maybe you're cutting out newspaper and collaging it in certain areas, going back over it with charcoal on top. If you know for sure you want to have maybe newspaper in the background of your charcoal portrait, maybe you draw one of your portraits directly onto newspaper ahead of time. But think about all the different things you could collage. You could do a lot with this. Maybe tissue paper you're collaging on top and then going back over with charcoal or watercolor. Maybe you print out some pictures of actual people that you've taken photographs of, and you're cutting out small pictures of people to make up the larger portrait. And here's another one, cutting out maybe pieces of magazines. There's plenty of magazines that you can go through, so let me know if you want to work with one. And same thing, these are just taking different pieces of paper, magazines, newspaper. You could look at the value change, so maybe you find some darker pages of newspaper or magazines and just put those into shadows, and then yellows or brighter colors you could cut out and put into the highlights. So there's a few more examples of collages. Consider using yarn or string. So this is a great way to show movement in your piece. It's a good way to connect where you want the viewer's eye to move throughout your artwork and just jump around from different facial features or to different areas. So this person, it looks like they maybe hole punched or wove that yarn in and out of the page. What's interesting about these is that it adds to the composition. So this one on the right, the string is coming out of the portrait in a creative way. Think about using multiple colors, like they have the light green and the dark green to create some value change. Again, there's a lot you could do with yarn to really tie things together. Maybe you have one portrait on the left, one on the right, and you're weaving those two portraits together with your yarn. Or just outlining specific facial features, like you're sewing some yarn in and out of your portrait. And this one's interesting how it's connecting the two, making it look like it's ripping apart. Or maybe you're just creating a background design or a pattern to add to the background of your portrait. All right, so this one really you could use any media for. So one example is watercolor, pastel, colored pencil. But think about how you could bring some color into your portrait. Since it's already black and white with charcoal, maybe in just the shadows you add a few blue tones. Or in the highlights, you just bring out a little bit of yellow in the cheeks or forehead and nose. Here's a few examples of how watercolor or different materials are brought in with color. Maybe with watercolor, you could have the paint dripping down, or you're just adding some colored pastel mixed in with the charcoal. Those two do blend well together. And again, this one on the left just has a little hints of color that they're bringing into the portrait. This next technique, number 5, is text. Think about maybe a poem that you could add into the background, or some words that you think go with the emotions that you're portraying in your portraits. Maybe it's just written in the background, like this one, or completely in the foreground, where in the shadow areas you're writing a lot more text, and then in the highlights you're using thinner, lighter, larger text to create dimension. So that could be interesting, just to go directly over your charcoal. Maybe you're doing a collage mixture with text, so the text is just part of the collage that you're writing over top of your portraits. Be creative. You could even add it into Photoshop with the text. And then the last one is Photoshop, and there's so many different directions you can take this. Let me know if you have an idea, but you're not sure how to accomplish it. But I would recommend using Photoshop if you're someone who really likes how your two portraits came out and you want to leave them as just the two portraits. That way you can take pictures of both of them and do different things in Photoshop versus ruining portraits that you're super happy with. So one example is maybe using the actual photo itself and overlaying and cutting things out. Or again, you're bringing some color and painting over top of it, or collaging your pictures together, playing around with the opacity. So there's a lot you could do with your portraits in Photoshop. This example on the right is a GIF, so think about if you want to create some sort of little animation, and I can show you the steps for that if you decide to go that route. And same thing with this one on the left. It's just an interesting way to bring a little bit of life into your images. If this is something you're interested in creating, let me know. And then this last example, the one on the right here, is a great example of cutting things out using just the same portrait and doing different things with it. So check out the video on Photoshop for more specific ways that you can use it. Again, there's a lot you can do. And then here's 2 more. You can draw on top of your image in Photoshop. Just make sure that your final 2 images, when you put everything back together, has first of all a clear focal point, follows the rule of thirds, has leading line, lead space, framing, and then the elements and principles that we talked about previously, a foreground, middle ground, and background. So just double check when you get to that last part or that last step that you did include each of those from the previous project that we were working on. And I will post these directions here specifically so that you're able to go back and look at those. If you're someone who is interested in photography and you want to do more with photography in the future, let me know and we can talk about ways to do this instead of drawing out completely your final 2 portraits. I'll still want you to do a lot of the practice with charcoal just to get a good understanding of shading and blending and things like that you can still do to your portraits in Photoshop. But again, if you're mainly interested in photography, let me know and we can talk specifically about how to make this project more photography based for you. But again, if you have questions about